Welcome to Legal Lines. My name is Tom O'Shea. I'm the host of this program that is brought to you by the York County Bar Foundation. My guest today is attorney Traci McPate. Welcome, Traci.
Thank you for having me.
And Traci is with the York County Public Defender's Office. She actually works for the Juvenile section of the Public Defender's Office. And the topic today is collateral consequences of a juvenile adjudication. Sounds like a big topic.
It's a very important one, Tom.
I understand that. That's why we're doing this show. So, but before we begin on the collateral consequences, can you talk a little bit about the differences between the juvenile system and the adult criminal system?
Of course. The juvenile delinquency system deals with children who have been charged with criminal offenses. But it is a system that is set up very differently than the adult criminal system, and it has a much different focus. When we're dealing with children in the juvenile delinquency system, the focus is not so much on punishment or punitive measures, but the focus is more on rehabilitation, victim restoration, those types of balancing aspects, so that when we have a child who has come into the system, ideally, when they leave, they have developed competencies that make them less likely to recidivate. So that's really the big difference between the juvenile delinquency system and the adult criminal system.
But the underlying offenses, the criminal statute, would it be the same criminal statute that would apply for an adult as a minor?
For the most part, there are a handful of offenses that would result in a child being charged as an adult directly, but for purposes of our discussion today, we'll really focus on those offenses that are only applying to children in the delinquency system.
Okay, so for example, if the crime was robbery, it would be the same elements of the crime for juvenile
Correct.
as it would be for an adult.
That is correct. And a lot of the same principles of the criminal justice system do apply to children in the sense that they have a lot of the same constitutional protections, such as protection from unreasonable search and seizures. They have the right to confront witnesses against them. And they also have the right to legal counsel at all stages of the proceeding. One thing that is different about the juvenile system is that juveniles are entitled and required to have a parent or a guardian with them whenever they appear in court.
Okay. And also, there's no right to a jury trial.
That's correct. All of the adjudications, or what we call fact-finding hearings, are before a judge, not in front of a jury.
So a juvenile charged with, let's say we go back to the example of robbery, would not have the right to demand a jury trial as would an adult who is charged with the same thing.
That is correct. Their case would be in front of a judge.
All right. And if found guilty, it's not called guilty.
Right. If the charges are substantiated, meaning that a judge has heard all the evidence and has determined beyond a reasonable doubt, the same standard that we see in the adult criminal system, that this child has committed all of the elements of the offense, then we say it's been substantiated.
Okay. And when we're talking about juveniles, what age are we talking about?
So juveniles are considered to be under the age of 18. And what we look at is we look at the date of the offense and what the age of the child was at that time.
So if somebody committed an act that they were charged for a crime, or a juvenile, if they were 17 but it didn't go to court till they were 18, they would still be in the juvenile system.
That is correct, yes. Technically, the juvenile delinquency court system can have jurisdiction over a child until age 21, again, as long as the age at the date of the offense was under 18.
Okay. And I think you touched on this, but you told me when we were preparing for this program that the juvenile system has different approaches and different goals. Can you elaborate on that?
And again, this is going back to the differences between the adult system, which focuses on punishing an offender, versus the juvenile delinquency system, which takes a more balanced approach. And we frequently refer to that as what we call the balanced and restorative justice principles. And really, we're looking at competency development, community safety and protection, and victim restoration. Not only do we seek to have accountability, but we also look to rehabilitate. meaning if there are issues that the child is dealing with, whether it's in the family, in the community, in the school setting, the juvenile justice system is tasked with trying to help that child address those issues. And again, the end goal is to help eliminate them coming back into the system and recidivating.
Okay. And if a juvenile is adjudicated delinquent, what type of sentencing are they looked at? Is it different standards than the adult criminal system?
It's treated very differently. First, even just from a semantic standpoint, a juvenile is adjudicated delinquent. They are not convicted. The term convicted and conviction is only for the adult criminal system. When a juvenile is adjudicated delinquent, they're found to be legally in need of treatment, rehabilitation, and supervision as defined by the Juvenile Act. And what that means is that they've been found to be under the supervision of the juvenile court, typically with juvenile probation, acting as the overseeing agency, who not only is going to be supervising the child, but also making sure that services are coordinated and put into place for the child and the family as needed. So when they're adjudicated delinquent, that is when all of these services and the supervision technically begin.
And they would sometimes be on probation at home. Sometimes there is a placement.
That is correct.
And where would that be?
That is correct. For children who are going to be placed outside the home, where they're placed largely depends upon what type of issues they're dealing with and what kind of services they need. We have programs that help juveniles who are dealing with drug and alcohol issues. We have programs for children who are dealing with mental health issues. And then we also have programs that are focused more on behavior modification and those competency development that we talked about earlier.
Okay. So there's a misconception, and I must say that I'm guilty of this because I do not do any juvenile law, that everything in a juvenile proceeding is confidential. It's automatically closed, it's sealed, and no one can get access to it, so that when the juvenile grows up, there's never any record of a juvenile offense. I always thought that, and I found out I was wrong.
Correct. At least in Pennsylvania, that is not true because our juvenile records are not sealed and they are not automatically expunged at a certain age. When I meet with clients and parents, that's usually the first question, or one of the first questions I'm asked is, well, when I turn 18 or 21, isn't this just going to go away as though it never existed? And unfortunately, again, at least in Pennsylvania, that is not how it is dealt with. Absent an expungement, which is basically an erasing of that record, it remains permanent.
All right, we're going to talk a little bit more about expungement later in the program, but I mean, the title of this program is The Collateral Consequences.
Correct.
And if these things are not sealed, employers can find out.
Correct.
Potential institutions of higher education. So let's talk about the collateral consequences. If someone who's a minor does something wrong, adjudicated delinquent, how could that affect them many years later in their adult life?
There are a number of different ways that an adjudication of delinquency can affect a juvenile moving forward in life. One of the immediate ways in which it can affect them has to do with employment. Employers, if they run criminal background checks, are frequently able to see the juvenile record. Depending on what type of field the juvenile is interested in going into, it could have an impact on whether or not they're able to obtain a professional license. A good example of that is a juvenile who's been adjudicated of any type of an assault. It may prevent them from being able to go into the nursing field or even to be able to work with the elderly. When we look at other avenues other than just in employment, we look at the military, for example. I work with a lot of clients who are nearing that age where they're going to be graduating from high school, and many would like to enlist. And again, if they have that adjudication, depending on what they've been adjudicated delinquent for, it could bar them from enlisting in one or all the branches of the military.
How would the potential employer or the military learn about this?
So the military obviously is going to have access to the criminal databases that all law enforcement has access to. As far as your private or public sector, I should say, employers, depending on who they're using to run their criminal background checks, again, it can show up. So we always make sure to advise juveniles that that is a potential issue, so that when they're filling out those job applications and they come to that section where it asks about criminal history, they have to be careful about how it's worded. Many of those applications will ask, have you ever been convicted of a misdemeanor or a felony offense? And again, that term convicted or conviction only applies to the adult system. So if it's worded that way, then the juvenile can honestly state, no, I have not been convicted of an offense. However, if it's worded in such a way that it asks if they've been convicted or adjudicated delinquent of a misdemeanor or a felony offense, then they're going to have to answer in the affirmative.
Let's say that it's not. It's worded, were you convicted of a crime? And the job applicant correctly, as you say, puts down, no, I haven't been. When the employer does a criminal background check, which many employers do these days, will the employer know the difference?
It will show up as a juvenile adjudication, so the wording will make it clear that this was a juvenile matter and not an adult criminal matter.
But it will still appear.
It will still appear.
So the job applicant may still have some questions to answer, assuming that the employer is willing to ask the questions, so the potential employer is willing to ask the questions instead of just dismissing the application.
Yes, and one of the areas that we see that, it has to do with retail work. If a juvenile has been convicted of any type of offense that involves theft or forgery, that's going to raise a red flag for an employer who's in the retail sector, because obviously it could create an issue down the road.
But this information is readily available to anyone doing a criminal background check?
Anyone who is able to do criminal background checks is going to be able to see it, but the general public is not going to be able to see that information.
So if I was a potential employer without hiring an agency and I just walked into the courthouse and said, can I see if this person has a juvenile record, what would the answer be?
It depends upon how old they were when they committed the offense and what the offense was, because there is some information that is available for public access.
Oh, I didn't know that. So, but for the most part, most of the juvenile offenses adjudications would be not open to the public.
Correct.
But they are open to law enforcement and to services that do background checks.
That is correct.
So, but there are some things that are open. Can you give an example of that?
So for an example, if we have a juvenile who was 14 or older at the time that he committed a felony offense, that information would be available to the public. They would be able to go into the courthouse, to the clerk of court's office, and access that information.
Is that information also available online?
No. The information would not be available to the general public online through AOPC, for example, because typically
AOPC is?
The Administrative Office of Pennsylvania Courts.
Okay.
It wouldn't be available through their database to a member of the general public because they would not be an authorized user to access.
I see. Okay, well, we're out of time for this first segment, but we'll be back. Welcome back to Legal Lines. Our guest today is attorney Traci McPate with the York County Public Defender's Office, where she handles the juvenile cases.
Yes.
And the topic of our program is the collateral consequences of a juvenile adjudication. And before the break, we were talking about how this could impact future employment, a juvenile record, how it could have impact future employment when someone's an adult, as well as trying to get into the military, because it could have an impact, a negative impact on that.
That's
but there are
correct.
many other areas where a juvenile record could impact a person later in life. And I'd like to talk about some of those areas.
Certainly. One of the other areas that we have to take into consideration is what happens after a juvenile turns 18 and then winds up getting criminal charges. There are situations in which the juvenile record can have an impact on the sentence that that person gets in the adult criminal system. Again, a good example is, looking at an adjudication where the child was 14 or older at the time of the offense and it was a felony offense. And now that adjudication, absent an expungement, can be added into that person's prior record score, meaning that when they are sentenced as an adult, that juvenile adjudication is going to have an impact on the length of sentence that they wind up receiving.
Yeah, so when you're talking about sentencing score, can you just tell us, those of us who don't handle criminal law, what that means?
Certainly. The basic sentencing guidelines are based upon what we call the prior record score and also an offense gravity score. Every crime is given what's called an offense gravity score based upon the severity of the offense. And a prior record score is just as it sounds. It takes into account other prior convictions and or adjudications of delinquency.
So, for example, if a juvenile commits an act and is adjudicated delinquent, 3-4 years later commits another criminal act and has no criminal record, if they didn't have a juvenile record, this would be a first offense.
Right, they would have a prior record score of a 0. But if they're adjudicated on one of the enumerated offenses, and again, based upon the age at the time of the offense, maybe they start off in the adult criminal system with a 2, a 3, or even higher.
Okay, which could affect the length of their sentence.
That's correct.
So that would be another very negative impact on having a juvenile record.
Certainly. I mean, we always hope that our juveniles never get additional charges, whether it's in the juvenile delinquency system or the adult system, but it can happen, and we always advise them of that possible problem down the road.
How about an impact that it could have on someone applying to college or getting financial aid for college?
For federal financial aid, adjudications of delinquency will not have an impact. It could be different with private lenders, though.
Okay.
And as far as institutions of higher education, for the most part, an adjudication of delinquency is not going to bar admission, especially now that a lot of institutions are using the common application, and the wording on that only refers to convictions and not adjudications of delinquency.
Okay, so, and here again, if you're not convicted because it's an adjudication, on the common application, you would not need to disclose anything.
That is correct.
And for those of you who do not know, the common application is something that most schools now use, where the student only has to fill out one application, but most colleges and universities accept that as the application. You just pay an extra fee.
Right.
Okay. What about future driver's licenses? Does it have any impact for that?
It certainly can. For juveniles who are adjudicated for offenses involving drugs or alcohol, DUI is the most common example. They will be subject to driver's license suspensions, and our judges do not have any discretion over that. Driver's license suspensions are established through the regulations of PennDOT. So if you are adjudicated on an offense that carries with it a mandatory driver's license suspension, then that is what you'll have to serve out.
Even if you become an adult during that time period?
Correct.
What about future ownership of firearms?
For more serious offenses, if a juvenile is adjudicated delinquent, it can result in them being barred from legally owning a firearm, and that ban can be all the way up to a lifetime ban.
But it depends on the underlying offense.
Correct.
But even if the offense occurred when someone was 16, for example, it could impact them for the rest of their life on
That is correct.
ownership of a firearm.
Yes.
Do you get immigration issues as a result of juvenile adjudication?
Certainly immigration issues, it can come up, and typically we red flag those cases because with the potential impact on legal status and the possibility of even deportation, our common practice is to consult with immigration attorneys when those issues appear to be in a case.
Okay, would that record the adjudication go beyond age 18 as well for immigration status?
I honestly don't know how that would affect it. I do know that we would have to look at what is being characterized as bad acts, and I believe that same standard is also looked at with adult convictions. So again, because of the potential of it having an impact on a legal status or even resulting in a child having to leave the jurisdiction or the country, we always consult with the experts in immigration law.
Okay, that's fair enough. Because you're the expert in this field, and I, like I said at the beginning of the show, I had very little knowledge of the juvenile system. But there are certain things you told me that it would not impact. Like, for example, one of the things you told me is student loans are not based on whether or not you have an adjudication for a juvenile offense.
Right. Also, too, an adjudication of delinquency is not going to prevent someone from being able to vote or to serve on a jury. And as we've already mentioned, it's not going to bar someone from most institutions of higher education, though again, keeping in mind, depending on what field someone might be looking to go into, there could be a problem with professional licensing.
Mm-hmm. Right. One of the things that we talked about, or you mentioned, we didn't talk about yet, but you mentioned is expungement.
Yes.
And that seems like a big, important issue in the juvenile world.
Expungements can be critical because an expungement is a way to remove a lot of these barriers. In the simplest terms, expungement is the wiping clean of a record. Now, for all practical purposes, records are never completely wiped clean. For example, law enforcement will always be able to access that information. But then when we're looking at employers in the public sector, when we're looking at landlords, when we're looking at schools, if we're looking at places where they're running these criminal background checks, through a third-party agency, they're not going to be able to access that information any longer. And again, that's a way to remove a lot of these barriers for employment, for even public housing.
Yes, I forgot to ask you about public housing as one of the things that could impact a juvenile record. If someone's in public housing and they live there with their 16-year-old child who is adjudicated delinquent, could that impact their right to stay in the public housing?
It can. The housing authority can initiate eviction proceedings against the family if the child has been adjudicated delinquent, even if the underlying offense did not occur on the property.
Okay, so another collateral consequence of the juvenile record,
Yes.
and that could affect the whole family.
Correct.
But let's go back to expungement. Is there a method to go about to get the record expunged?
Right, and this goes back again to the common misperception that at 18 or 21, a juvenile record just suddenly disappears and goes away.
I said in the first part of the show, I had that common misperception. So,
and it's the same thing with an expungement. It's not automatic. There are a couple of different ways that an expungement can be accomplished. Once a juvenile has successfully completed juvenile probation and their case has been closed out for a period of 5 years, they can apply for an expungement.
So for most people, this would be long after they're a juvenile.
Correct.
So they might be in their early 20s.
Right.
They thought this was all behind me. Now I better go hire a lawyer and seek to have my record expunged?
Exactly, and what we do is we, in our office, we will, file the paperwork for them. And one of the things that the judge is going to look at before deciding whether or not to grant a motion for expungement. They're going to look to see if there have been any additional juvenile charges that they've been adjudicated delinquent on, and are there any pending charges as well. So we always advise our clients that, for that 5-year period, you want to make sure that you have absolutely no other charges, whether they're adult or juvenile. The judge is also going to consider things like where that person is as far as education, and where they are as far as their employment history, and whether or not the underlying charges are preventing them from taking opportunities, in furthering their education or, furthering their employment.
So if someone were to apply, you said that you have to wait 5 years?
You have to wait 5 years. Well, the most common method is to have to wait 5 years after successful completion of juvenile probation, or when a juvenile turns 18 with the approval of the Commonwealth, the district attorney's office. But again, ultimately the judge makes that final decision looking at those same factors that we just discussed.
So how would that work? If someone's being adjudicated delinquent, they can ask the judge right then and there?
No, it would have to come once they have completed that 5-year period and after they've been off of probation. It's not something that happens at the time of adjudication.
So is this something that would be recommended by the probation officer?
What we typically tell our clients is that once they have reached that milestone is to contact either the probation office, who then in turn contacts our office, or they can contact us directly and we can get the process started for expungement. There's one other way that we commonly see for an expungement, and that's something called a consent decree. A consent decree is a diversionary tool that we have in the delinquency system that allows for a juvenile to apply for an expungement after approximately 1 year. So it's a much quicker way to get it done, and it's usually for juveniles who have no prior history in the juvenile justice system.
Again, that goes before a judge?
Not always. In some cases, it's not in front of a judge. In other cases, it has gone before a judge, but the disposition is an informal one.
Is this something that you need approval from the district attorney's office to obtain?
Yes. For the consent decree, the district attorney's office must approve it for it to take effect.
Is this something, if there was a victim of the crime, would they have any say?
Yes, in many cases, the district attorney's office will seek the input of not only the victim, if there is a victim in the case, but also the arresting officer as well.
Okay, so this is something that, how frequently are they granted then, these consent expungements?
I would say that our district attorney's office is very generous in most cases, and I think...
I assume they're only generous if the young person got his or her act together.
Again, some of the things, that they're going to be considering is the seriousness of the offense. They're also going to be looking to see, what is this child doing as far as education, how they're doing in school, how they're doing in home.
Okay,
What are other extenuating?
I'm going to have to cut you off here, but I think we get the general idea. Our guest today was attorney Traci McPate. The topic was collateral consequences of a juvenile adjudication. Thank you.
Thank you.